You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme, a boost for nuclear power as the government injects £100 million into Sizewell C. How the conflict between Russia and Ukraine could affect the future of Europe's gas supply. And a rare winter storm in the Middle East blankets the region in snow, shutting down public services and leaving refugees struggling to survive. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with the solutions. Now, plans for a new nuclear power project, Sizewell C, have been given a £100 million cash injection by the government. While ministers believe more nuclear power will boost the UK's energy resilience, climate activists say this grant shows it's not a commercially viable source of energy. So let's take a closer look at the role of nuclear power in the UK's future energy makeup. Now, as you can see from this graph, nuclear power peaked here in the late 90s when 17 nuclear power stations were operational and generating over a quarter of the UK's electricity. But in 2021, nuclear accounted for just 14% of electricity in Great Britain, generated by the 8 nuclear power station sites shown here. And almost half of the country's current capacity is to be retired by 2025. They'll be replaced by potentially 3 reactors: Hinkley Point C, Bradwell B and Sizewell C, which has just received £100 million to continue development of the site. Now, Sizewell C will produce 3.2 gigawatts of electricity that should amount to approximately 7% of the country's needs. Well, our science and technology editor, Tom Clark, joins us now. So, Tom, what does this £100 million cash injection from the government tell us about their nuclear ambitions?
Well, this is seen as a vote of confidence from the government in Sizewell C, and that's significant for 2 main reasons. Firstly, almost every analyst you speak to says we are going to need some amount of nuclear power, and a lot more than we've already got, to meet our net zero targets by 2050. Right now, we're spending quite a lot of money to switch on gas power stations, sometimes even coal power stations, on cold, windy days like we're seeing from cold, windless days like we're seeing at the moment, when renewable energy from wind, when solar power is not available. You need extra baseline energy that's low carbon or zero carbon on your grid to meet net zero. And nuclear, quite rightly claim, they are a very good contender for supplying that energy. So a vote of confidence in Sizewell C makes it more likely that it's going to come on stream and we'll get that bit closer to our net zero ambitions for the grid as a whole. The other reason this 100 million is important is it shows there's willingness, and it demonstrates willingness to the investment community. Because the other thing that nuclear has got to prove, if it wants to be a contender, is that it can be value for money. And EDF, who are proposing to build Sizewell C, have got quite a lot of work to do in that regard, because Hinkley Point C, its sister reactor, which should have been completed in 2017, is still under construction, isn't expected now to be completed until 2026. It's gone colossally over budget, and they have to make a case that we're not going to see similar cost overruns and similar burdens on the bill payers due to costs from Sizewell C. The government are putting forward a different funding model for Sizewell C that takes less of the risk out of it to attract investment, but it does put more of the ownership on us, the electricity bill payers in the UK. But if they can satisfy the investment community, it's possible we'll get a better deal for Sizewell C, and that's part of what this money is, and that's why it's significant. It's sending that signal out there. But they still have a lot to prove. I mean, there are some estimates that Hinkley Point C is going to put £10 to £15 on each of our energy bills for the next 35 years. We can't afford something as expensive as that to happen again. Some people in the community are saying where nuclear power really needs to go beyond these 2 big plants, and possibly that third one in Bradwell you mentioned in the graphic, is for smaller modular reactors that are less of a burden in terms of investment, but still low carbon and still a good way of generating a baseload electricity supply to complement a grid that's got lots of renewables on it as we move towards net zero.
Now, while the UK government intends to continue using nuclear energy, Germany is phasing it out altogether by the end of this year. It makes the country, for now at least, dependent on coal and gas, much of which they get from Russia. Well, as tensions between Russia and Ukraine continue, the Nordstream 2 pipeline project, which will supply gas from Russia to Germany, is being used to pressure Moscow into retreat. Our Europe correspondent Adam Parsons reports from Lubmin on the northern coast of Germany, where the pipeline makes landfall.
It is windswept, cold and empty here, a seaside resort out of season. But what happens in Lubmin could yet be crucial. There are echoes of Soviet times. A former nuclear power plant stands idle and ugly, and Russian influence is still strong here. This is the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. It links Germany with Russia, capable of supplying enough energy for 26 million German households. It's either a precious resource or a sign of Russia's creeping control, or maybe both.
Angela Merkel always insisted this was just a commercial venture, but in reality Nord Stream 2 is probably the most contentious building project in the world. It's been opposed by a whole load of leaders, including Donald Trump and successive Ukrainian governments. It ties together Germany and Russia, and now a group of Western allies, including Britain and America, wants Germany to unpick that knot, to accept the possibility of sanctions against the Russian energy industry, even the spectre that Nord Stream 2 could be shut down altogether.
Germany well remembers the pain of conflict between East and West, and Chancellor Olaf Scholz has agreed only reluctantly to embrace sanctions, including on Nord Stream 2. That's a point repeated today by his foreign minister, that he won't supply weapons to Ukraine. His critics say he's too passive and that his hesitancy has harmed Germany's reputation.
I think the government should revisit their position and think about supplying weapon systems to the Ukraine. But when it comes to Germany, we overcome the Cold War because we could rely on others. Now it's up to us to support the countries which are now on the front line.
This is a rich country with ties to Russia and an ingrained sense of dread of another war. Among this group of Ukrainians living in Berlin, a sense of anxiety and disappointment.
We are like the allies, we are like the friends, and we're not getting the support. And we're just very sad, and we also feel like powerless at this point, that what should we do?
The German government has to show clear position, but also active things that they can do, financial support, also support with supplies.
I think we need sanctions on Russia, and to increase these sanctions and to show with all measures and possibilities that with every Russian aggressive step on Ukrainian border there will be like harsh and quick answer.
And that is Germany's challenge, to support its NATO allies without ostracising its Russian gas suppliers. But backing both horses is never easy. Adam Parsons, Sky News, Berlin.
Now, for some of the day's other climate news, and the FTSE 100 company M&G plans to invest up to £500 million over the next 3 to 5 years in sustainable housing. They've invested in house builder Greencore Construction, which currently has the capacity to deliver 1,000 carbon-positive homes in the Thames Valley region. With the new funding, Greencore says it will roll out their carbon-positive homes to other parts of the UK. The US Environmental Protection Agency has created new measures to tackle air pollution and unsafe drinking water in 3 Gulf Coast states. They'll install air monitoring equipment in Louisiana's chemical corridor and will conduct unannounced inspections of chemical plants in Mississippi and Texas. Cancer risks in the region are far above national levels, with African Americans and other minority groups making up to 56% of those living there. More than 1 in 5 councils in the UK have no climate action plan, according to Climate Emergency UK. Out of 325 council plans that they scored, only 86 of those have set a net zero target of 2030 or earlier, and 33% of the councils had failed to set a net zero target of 2050 or earlier. Now, a winter storm has brought extreme weather to several countries in the Middle East. The rare cold snap has already caused disruption in the eastern Mediterranean and has brought services across the region to a standstill. Well, in Jerusalem, the main roads in the city were closed after as much as 8 inches of snow overnight. And in Jordan, the capital city of Amman woke to a rare blanket of overnight snow which blocked roads and damaged the electricity network. And it's also affecting refugees in northern Syria on the Turkey border, where 3 children have already died in the freezing conditions. Our Middle East correspondent, Alistair Bunkle, reports.
It doesn't often snow in Jerusalem, but the ancient city, high up in the Judean hills, is today covered in white. For Jerusalemites, it's an impromptu day off. Schools, shops, restaurants are all closed. This city, that is so used to the sound of division and disagreement, is briefly peaceful and quiet under its soft white blanket. Snowstorms have swept through the Middle East in recent days. Istanbul Airport, one of the world's busiest, all but shut down earlier this week. In Jordan, the capital Amman was also brought to a standstill. The freak weather has created havoc in a region more used to hot temperatures.
Occasionally, the jet stream will get weaker and sometimes it gets wobbly or kind of bendy. And that means that very, very cold polar air can travel much further south than it normally does. You can compare it to when the UK has a snow day and all trains cease to operate. Just imagine that being in a country which is really, really unused to having this kind of level of snowfall.
There have been desperate scenes in northern Syria and Lebanon. Tens of thousands of refugees have spent nights in freezing temperatures, unable to afford heating. Hundreds of tents collapsed under the snow, making life even more miserable. At least 3 children have died in the cold.
The camp is very cold. The caravans are just like ice boxes, like a freezer. As soon as I turn on my heater, it becomes a freezer. Can there be more suffering than this?
The weather should get warmer again next week. It will open up a path for aid workers to get urgent help to the thousands who really need it. Alistair Bunkle, Sky News in Jerusalem.
Do stay tuned. Coming up here on the Daily Climate Show, I'll be joined by Joycelyn Longdon, founder of Climate in Colour, and Richard Black, senior associate and founder of the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. And we're going to be discussing whether taxpayer money should be spent on new nuclear power stations and who are our climate action role models. Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. And we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day now with founder of Climate in Colour, Joycelyn Longdon, and Senior Associate at the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, Richard Black. So hello to both of you. Nice to see you both. So, first of all, the government is to invest £100 million into Sizewell C, a nuclear power station in Suffolk that will likely cost more than £20 billion in total and take nearly a decade to build. So, an important vote of confidence in a low-carbon power source, or would taxpayer money be better spent elsewhere? Richard, what do you think? Do we need nuclear power? Has the latest crisis over gas supply and rising energy prices demonstrated a need for another source of homegrown energy, do you think?
Sure, it matters terribly much either way, to be honest. As Tom was saying earlier, Tom Clark, there are a lot of analysts who say that basically Britain would be better off with a certain amount of nuclear power. But you have to remember that neither this nor Hinkley is going to come online for at least a decade. And so by then, I suspect that the energy system will look rather different. Renewables will be even cheaper than they are now. I think storage will be much cheaper than it is now. And those are much quicker and easier to build as well. So one thing I think the government has been wise about, though, is if it is going to build, if it does want nuclear power stations to be built, if it views these as a kind of national asset, then involve public money, because the costs of financing it are just lower if you put some of the public money behind it. And that's one of the reasons why this is projected to be a little cheaper than the Hinkley deal.
Well, yes, and money always comes up in the conversation, doesn't it, Joycelyn? But what about this idea of needing a low-carbon energy source that's reliable, whatever the weather? I mean, nuclear fulfills that, doesn't it? What do you make of it as an option?
Yeah, of course. From a science perspective, nuclear is really important because Currently, we're not in a position to have a really stable, renewable grid. But I think I'm going to echo what Richard just said about when this is going to come online. It's really not part of our net zero target. The timeline for them and also the expense that needs to go into them, they're more of a legacy project. So I think we need to be really intentional about where we're putting a huge amount of our focus and our priority into building infrastructure, and could that be going into making a more reliable grid with renewables as they are, considering how much quicker they have decreased in price and increased in reliability. Nuclear has been around for a very long time, and we're still not really getting the results that we need for this low carbon grid. So those would be my reservations.
Yes, and yet, Richard, it's really interesting to look at other countries and their take on nuclear. I mean, France obviously backs it. Germany, in the meantime, is phasing out its entire nuclear capacity, isn't it? And partly over safety fears. I mean, it was triggered after the Fukushima disaster, wasn't it? Their decision-making. So what do you make of what's going on elsewhere in Europe?
Well, the German decision was actually made first in the year 2000. And then shortly before Fukushima, entirely coincidentally, the government decided to elongate the lifetime of nuclear power stations. And then when we had Fukushima, they reinstated the original date. And basically all the German nuclear stations will be closed at the end of this year. Really, the German situation is all to do with the Cold War. Germany was the frontline state in Europe for a possible nuclear conflict during the Cold War. And that's left a definite imprint on the German psyche, and no one really in the country is up for nuclear at all, which obviously from a climate change point of view isn't great, but I think given the history of Germany, it's entirely understandable. There aren't many countries in the world that plan to go big on nuclear. You look at China, you look at India, but even then their nuclear ambitions are dwarfed by their renewable ambitions. And as we saw, China, installed a vast amount of offshore wind last year. And then you've got a few other countries like France, as you said, but really on a global scale, one expects the share of nuclear electricity to be dwindling. And that's for a whole number of reasons. But I think number one is the cost and the ease of building renewables.
A very quick thought from you, Jocelyn, on this. I mean, are you saying basically you just like the money all spent on renewables?
It's not that the money should all be spent on renewables. You have to remember that the climate crisis isn't just about energy, and it's not a sort of one issue crisis. We obviously have to spend money in lots of different places, but it's just prioritizing how much of that money. And because the money, it kind of shows the public what the focus is for the government. And so it should be proportional to what is really working and what is really going to get us to the targets, to ensure that customers and the public really understand what has efficacy and what works and what is going to get us to our targets.
OK, let's move on to our next topic. And we're asking, who are the role models that we look up to on climate action today? And we're asking this because of the sad news this week of the death of Sir Crispin Takel at the age of 91. Now, he was a diplomat and environmentalist who had the ear of Margaret Thatcher and wrote a book in 1977 called Climactic Change and World Affairs, which argued for an international treaty on pollution. And Richard, I understand that you did know Crispin Takel. So tell us a little bit about him and how influential you think he was in changing minds on climate policy.
Yes, I spent a bit of time with him in the last decade, basically when we opened the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit in 2014. So Crispin was one of a number of people who came onto our advisory board. And he was extremely interesting guy, very urbane, very diplomatic in that sense of word, had a wry sense of humour. But his impact, both on the UK and internationally, I think, is far greater than his public profile. As you said, he convinced Margaret Thatcher, basically, that climate change was a serious issue. In 1989, she devoted her entire annual speech to the UN General Assembly to the environmental crisis. And it's a fantastic speech. I would urge anyone to go and read it. Now, Margaret Thatcher was a scientist herself, and one of the things Sir Crispin said to me was that when they talked about any other issue, she was a politician. When they talked about climate change, she acted as a scientist. So basically, without that, the history of the UK involvement, the cross-party consensus, the involvement of the Conservative Party in climate change would have been very different.
Okay.
And if she had not called for a UN treaty in that speech in 1989, perhaps we wouldn't have a United Nations Climate Convention.
So, Joyce, it's really interesting, isn't it, that there are figures like this that seem to have had a big impact. Would you agree that it's generally speaking government advisors and government ministers who have the most impact because they're changing policy? Or do you think we should give a shout out to celebrities or influencers that start shifting public opinion, which puts pressure on politicians? Who would you say are the best, most effective role models at the moment?
I think I would have to disagree with both. I think we're missing a huge trick in understanding that climate leadership and climate impact is not equivalent to status. That value doesn't come with visibility. And there are lots of climate leaders who don't have any status, who aren't known at all, who are really making huge changes. Either they are pushing policy in local governments, they are putting their own actual bodies in front of people who are destructing our world. And there are people in workplaces, in homes, in schools who are also leading this. And I think that sometimes we get a bit distracted by those in the forefront. And sometimes we actually rely on them to do a lot of the heavy lifting without realizing that we could also be climate leaders and take up that position as well.
Richard, do you think that's right, that actually some of the real heroes are people we've never heard of?
Yeah, I think there's an awful lot of real heroes that we never hear of. I was thinking of some of the UK diplomats, for example, who've been involved in COP26, who worked all the hours that were on this earth over the last year, and probably their names aren't known very much outside their own lunchtimes, as the saying goes. I think basically, you've got three constituencies that are vitally important here. One's the public, one is politicians and government, and the other is business. And you can find examples of real leadership in all of them. Just take one example, electric cars. Why are we now going to a situation where motoring is going to be electric? We've had scientific and technical innovations. We've had groups like Greenpeace who are ahead of the time arguing for these things. We've had a Norwegian government that grasped the nettle, and went ahead and implemented it and showed it could be done. And we've had business leaders like Elon Musk who have really changed the entire business and investment conversation about electric cars. So it's the whole mix there.
So, Joyce, would you agree with that? You're nodding away there. We should give credit to people across the board.
Yes, I think we need to realise that, climate change and climate action, and actually any social action that's happened in the past, although there seem to be these kind of figureheads or people at the helm of the action, it's actually a really huge group effort. And there are so many different perspectives that come in, so many different parts of that action that have huge domino effects on what actually ends up happening in the end. And we need to really keep that in mind. Otherwise, we do those people a disservice who have put so much hard work into bringing these together, and we reduce the problems that we have. We reduce the complexity and the amount of different perspectives and skills that we need to fix our issues.
OK, well, Joycelyn Longdon, Richard Black, always fascinating to get your views. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Well, tomorrow I'll be joined by environmental activist Judy Ling Wong and editor-in-chief of Business Green, James Murray. So join us for that. But for today, thanks for watching. See you next time.